Now that we understand about focus and focus point selection, the next thing we need to cover is depth of field and apertures. Now we've already looked at apertures and what an aperture does. We know that the aperture is a hole that we can control the size of to control the amount of light coming through. But the aperture also serves another creative process, and that is depth of field. Now, to demonstrate what depth of field is, if I focused on this pen here on this line, and this was my focus line along here, and these pens were out of focus, I'll just do that, and I'll use an aperture that is fully open.
With a large aperture setting of f1.4 and a shutter speed of 1/320th of a second, our exposure scale is indicating that we have the correct exposure. We focused on the red pen by using the right-hand side focus selector.
Okay, now we can see in that image how the red pen is sharp and the other pens are drifting out of focus. But only the red pen is sharp because that's the point that I focused on. Now what I'm going to do now is I'm going to reduce the size of that aperture and close it down a little bit to increase depth of field. And let's see what that does. So I'm going to drop that aperture down from 1.4 in this instance down to 5.6. Right, now you'll find it very difficult to see the image because it's become a lot darker as I've dropped the size of the aperture and shrunk that down and reduced the amount of light coming through. So to compensate for that, I need to increase the amount of time. I need to open the shutter speed for a longer period of time. So I'm going to actually shut the aperture down even smaller on this occasion, right down to f16, which is a really tiny small hole. And I'm going to have to compensate and bring the shutter speed right down to get the right amount of light back in on the picture. Remember, we're using the camera in manual mode, and that's the best way to do it to learn. We'll take the same picture again, and there we go. Now look at this. This is an incredible difference. Here we have the same photo taken at f16, a very small hole, very small aperture size, and it's still focused on the red one. This was where we focused, but look how much sharper the image is all the way through. It's so sharp now we can even see through and see these pictures leaning against the wall in the background. Now let's compare that to the earlier one with the aperture fully open. That's the one where we didn't compensate with the shutter speed, and that's the one with the aperture fully open. You can just make out those pictures as a dark blob leaning against the wall in the background, and you can see how all those pens drift out of focus, whereas in that one they're all sharp, running right through.
Here in this example, we can see that a very small aperture has given us large depth of field, and our picture is sharp from the foreground through to the background. In this instance, the correct exposure was obtained with f22 and 1/40th of a second. A much more pleasing result occurs when we blur the background by using a large aperture. Now our model stands out from what was a busy background. To do this, I open the aperture to a larger size at f2.8. This let considerably more light through, so to keep the exposure correct, I selected a much faster shutter speed.
So if we had a focus point here, this was where we focused along that plane, and our focus range ran from about there to there with the aperture fully open. Now as I shrunk that aperture down, the depth of sharpness increased way back here and all the way forward here. So our range of sharpness increased dramatically as we shut that aperture down. Let's just look at that on the graphics board that we used earlier. And here we shot it with a large aperture, and that gave us the shallow depth of field. And then we shut that aperture down and it became smaller and smaller until we got to f16 and we had a tiny hole, and that increased the depth of sharpness in our image by using the smaller aperture, but it also cut down the amount of light that was available, and to compensate, we had to slow the shutter speed and lower the shutter speed to let more light in. And that is how we control depth of field. By using the camera in manual, selecting the aperture that we want to use to get the best depth of field. Now, full open apertures are great for portraiture. They blur the background and just bring the focus on the face or on the eyes of your subject, and they give a brilliant result for portraiture photography. And quite often they're really good for nature photography as well. Whereas in landscape photography, quite often we want larger depth of field because we'd like to have the depth of focus right from our foreground in our landscape extending right off into the distance. So we choose which aperture and which setting we desire based on the creative process required for the type of photography we're undertaking.